In the autumn of 2015, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal named John Carreyrou published a story about a Silicon Valley startup called Theranos. The story was not long. It did not contain revelations that were easy to process in a single reading. But what it alleged, carefully, specifically with named sources and documentary evidence, was that the company's founder, a 31-year-old Stanford dropout named Elizabeth Holmes, had built a $9 billion medical technology company around a blood testing technology that did not work. The story alleged that Theranos had been performing the vast majority of its tests on conventional machines made by third-party manufacturers, not on the revolutionary proprietary device it had been marketing to investors, partners, and patients. The story alleged that the results produced by Theranos' own devices were unreliable to a degree that posed genuine risk to patient safety. And the story alleged that Holmes and her company had known this for years and had taken systematic steps to prevent anyone from finding out. Theranos responded by calling the story false, threatening legal action against Carreyrou and his sources, and publicly denying every substantive allegation. Within 2 years, the company no longer existed. Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. Her family was comfortable. Her father worked in government and later in private industry, and Elizabeth grew up in the kind of environment that produced confident, ambitious people who expected to do significant things. She enrolled at Stanford to study chemical engineering and left after her freshman year at 19 to found a company. The company's original concept was a patch that would detect infections and administer medication. It evolved. By the mid-2000s, it had become something more specific and more audacious. A platform for performing comprehensive blood tests from a single small drop of blood taken with a finger prick, rather than a conventional venous blood draw. The device that would perform these tests was called the Edison. Holmes's pitch was that it would democratize access to medical testing, that a finger prick instead of a needle would remove the barrier of needle anxiety that prevented many people from getting tested, that the small blood volume required would make testing accessible in pharmacies and retail clinics, and that the lower cost of the technology would make comprehensive blood panels available to people who could not otherwise afford them. The vision was compelling. It was also, according to every credible assessment that has since been made by people with the relevant technical expertise, impossible to achieve with the technology that actually existed. The fundamental problem with Theranos' core claim was not a matter of engineering execution. It was a matter of physics and chemistry. Performing the dozens of different blood tests that a comprehensive panel requires, each of which has different requirements for sample volume, reagent concentrations, and detection sensitivity, on a single small drop of blood is not a problem that can be solved by better engineering. The sample volume is simply insufficient for many of the tests to produce reliable results. This was known to experts in laboratory medicine long before Theranos was founded. It remained known throughout the period in which Holmes was raising hundreds of millions of dollars from investors and signing agreements with major pharmacy chains and the United States military. The technical experts who reviewed Theranos' claims consistently raised the same objections. Holmes's response consistently was that Theranos had solved the problem through proprietary methods that could not be disclosed for competitive reasons. It was an answer that was difficult to disprove without access to the technology itself, and Holmes was extremely effective at preventing anyone from gaining that access. What made Theranos possible, what allowed a technology that did not work to raise $900 million in funding and achieve a peak valuation of $9 billion, was a combination of factors that intersected in a specific and catastrophic way. Holmes was extraordinarily effective at projecting confidence and vision. She had adopted a personal aesthetic, black turtleneck, deep artificially lowered voice, intense eye contact, that she deployed with self-conscious deliberateness to project the image of a serious visionary in the tradition of Steve Jobs, whose biography she had studied carefully. She recruited a board of directors that was extraordinary for its prestige and almost entirely devoid of anyone with relevant scientific expertise. It included George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, the former general who would later become Secretary of Defense, and several other figures of comparable stature. The board's function, in practice, was not to provide oversight, but to provide legitimacy. Investors who might otherwise have demanded access to technical validation were reassured by the presence of names they recognize. The names recognized the opportunity. Nobody looked at the science. The investors who funded Theranos were also, for the most part, not people with biomedical expertise. The largest investors included the Walton family, the DeVos family, and media magnate Rupert Murdoch. Sophisticated investors with enormous wealth and essentially no capacity to evaluate the specific technical claims Theranos was making. They were betting on Holmes, on the board, and on the vision. The vision was extraordinary. The bet was wrong. The person who finally looked at the science was John Carreyrou. He had been contacted by a former Theranos employee who was concerned about what the company was doing. Carreyrou was an experienced investigative journalist with a track record of medical reporting. He spent months developing sources, reviewing documents, and consulting with laboratory medicine experts who consistently told him the same thing. What Theranos claimed to be doing was not possible with any known technology. His November 2015 article was the first credible public challenge to Holmes's narrative. She responded aggressively. Theranos hired lawyers, sent threatening letters, pressured sources, and went on a media offensive that Holmes personally led. The strategy failed because the evidence was more durable than the denials. In 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found that Theranos's laboratory practices posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety and banned Holmes from operating a laboratory for 2 years. The company's partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway collapsed. The FDA issued findings that invalidated Theranos's tests. In 2018, Holmes and her former president and romantic partner, Ramesh Balwani, were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The charges allege that Holmes had knowingly deceived investors, doctors, and patients about the capabilities of Theranos's technology. Holmes was convicted in January 2022 on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani was convicted on all 12 counts against him and sentenced to nearly 13 years. Holmes entered federal prison in May of 2023. She is expected to be released in 2032. The Theranos story is, on its surface, a straightforward fraud case. A person made false claims, raised money based on those claims, and was ultimately convicted for it. But the specific details of how it happened, the mechanism by which a technology that didn't work raised $900 million from sophisticated investors, reveals something more uncomfortable. The investors who funded Theranos were not naive. They were experienced, intelligent people who had made fortunes by evaluating risk correctly in other domains. What failed was not their intelligence. What failed was a specific protocol. The requirement that any medical technology investment be evaluated by people with the relevant medical and scientific expertise, regardless of how compelling the vision or how impressive the board. Holmes understood this gap and exploited it with extraordinary effectiveness for over a decade. The result was not just financial losses for wealthy investors. It was potentially incorrect blood test results provided to patients who made medical decisions based on them. That part of the story, the patient safety implications, has never been fully audited. The full extent of the harm done may never be known. Subscribe to The Reckoning.